Hey there, my name's Mike. I'm one of the engineers here at Buf. And in this video, we're going to explore Protobuf dependency management, one of the core features of the Buf Schema Registry, as well as the Buf CLI tool. At a high level, it's a feature that allows you to share Protobuf files without ever having to copy or vendor them. So for example, at large and small organizations, you might have a common set of Protobuf definitions that you want to share across repositories or across team boundaries. And with dependency management, this becomes manageable now. So what are some of the benefits? Well, one, there's a single source of truth where those Protobuf files are. As a producer, I know exactly where I'm pushing to, and as a consumer, I know exactly where I'm pulling those files from. And with this model in place, you then establish clear ownership. Who owns these Protobuf files? Who's responsible and who's maintaining them? With what permissions can they be updated with? And likewise, who can then consume them? And the third point is often overlooked, but it's quite important. You want to ensure that the proto files that you're depending on are actually valid proto files. And this is the power of a purpose-built schema registry, specifically for proto files. When you depend on something from the BSR, the Buf Schema Registry, you have some confidence that those files are going to integrate and work within your project. And lastly, you want to keep up to date with your dependencies. We do this for most programming languages. The same should be true for Protobuf files. Schemas evolve over time, and there's no reason why we can't keep up to date with them easily. We won't spend too much time in this section, but historically, if you wanted to solve the problem of depending on proto files from another location, you'd either use Git submodules, but unfortunately that leads to a poor developer experience, or you would copy and paste the files or the definitions around. But that comes with its own slew of problems. One is it's usually error prone because you're doing it manually. And two, you don't really have a single source of truth, which really defeats the purpose of having a schema in the first place. So anyways, neither of these solutions are great. And that's why the Buf Schema Registry as well as the Buf CLI tooling come with first-class support to solve this problem. And so in the next section, why don't we go step by step, and I'll show you what this looks like in practice. So here in our editor, what we have is a basic Protobuf project. It contains a single package, poke API /v1, and it's located at the root of this proto directory. Now, as a convention, I like to put all proto-related things into a single directory because in larger projects, you might have additional source code and configuration files, and so it's nice to be able to go into one place within your project to see all the Protobuf-related things. So what we have here is a Pokédex service. You can imagine we're building an API. It has a single endpoint, get Pokemon, and the idea is simple. You send it a name, and it returns to you a well-defined Pokemon message. But where it gets interesting is, instead of us defining this Pokemon message on line 20, we're instead going to rely on somebody else's Protobuf files that already have a Pokemon message defined. So we're effectively creating a dependency on another set of Protobuf files. So why don't we hop on over to the schema registry and take a look. What we have here is the Buf Schema Registry, or BSR for short. It's a purpose-built registry specific for Protobuf files. We'll do a deep dive in another video, but for the sake of this demonstration, what we want to do is find a module that contains our Pokemon definitions. So I know ahead of time that there's this organization called Pixel Perfect, which contains a module called Game Types that has a Pokemon package. Now, at a high level, modules are a collection of Protobuf packages that are built, versioned, and distributed as a single logical unit. And so what we want to do is create a dependency on this module. So let's go ahead and click on Pokemon V1, and we can see that there's useful messages, there's useful enums, and what we want is to depend on this Pokemon message. Now, there are two things you need to know. The module identity, so in this particular case, it'll be buf.build/pixelperfect/gametypes, and you need to know the import path. Since all import paths are path-based in Protobuf, let's go ahead and grab this, so then we can pop this over into our project. So let's go ahead and import this at the top. And you'll see that we don't actually have this types.proto in our project. Instead, what we're going to do is create a dependency on this module. And to do that, we need to run buf mod init. And what this will do is create a buf.yaml file. In this particular case, I always want everything to be at the root of my proto directory. And you want your configuration file to live alongside your packages. So this buf.yaml file allows you to specify certain things like breaking changes or lint rules, but we're not going to get into that in this video. Instead, what we want to do is give buf an idea of where to find this dependency. So in this particular case, we're grabbing it from the schema registry. So what we do is we copy the module reference and we add that as a dependency. Now, if we run a command like buf.lint, we'll see that it's going to fail. But it will say that you should run buf mod update. So let's go ahead and run that. Oh, sorry. I need to always point it at the root of where my buf.yaml file is. So let's go ahead and run buf mod update again. And you'll see this will create a buf.lock file. Now, this is a file that you never touch by hand. You instead let the buf set of commands like buf mod update, buf mod prune, and so forth update these for you. And what it is a lock file that you commit into your version control system, and it defines your direct and transitive dependencies. So in this particular case, we're depending on buf.build pixel perfect game types at a very specific commit. So every time you push a commit to the buf schema registry, you're bumping the commit as you push. And we can actually verify that this commit exists on the schema registry. So why don't we go ahead and take a look. In the activity tab, whoops, session expired, log in, refresh. What we see is the latest commit is 0f. That is indeed the commit that we're depending on. And if you wanted to, you could pin a specific commit. So if we, let's say, grab the previous one and we go into our buf.yaml file, you can do :commit name. But typically, you want to stay up to date with the latest schema. And that's what the lock file will pull in. Now, Google APIs is another popular module in the Protobuf ecosystem. Pixel Perfect has a dependency on this one. So in your lock file, you also have those transitive dependencies. Cool. So now if we run buf.lint proto, we can see that it's complaining that types.proto is not used. So buf actually knows how to use this file. So why don't we go ahead and add our Pokemon dependency. So let's get rid of the message that we're going to define, and let's go ahead and import Pokemon.v1. So Pokemon.v1. And you can already see that life is good. We've created a dependency without ever having to copy those files around. Now, the way this resolution works is when you run any buf commands, what they first do is they check for this file in your local project. And if buf doesn't find them there, it then takes a look at the buf.yaml file to see if you've specified it in dependencies. And then in order, it pulls those dependencies down and checks to see if that path exists. And if it exists, then it knows how to resolve this identifier. So hopefully that was helpful. And let's do a quick recap of the things we covered in this video. Finally, there's a Protobuf dependency management solution that does not require vendoring or copying Protobuf files. Instead, you lean into the Buf Schema Registry as well as the Buf CLI tooling to simplify your Protobuf workflows. And it's a few easy steps. One is you add a module identity into your deps key in the buf.yaml configuration file. So remember, a module identity is the schema registry, buf.build/owner, which is either a user or an organization, /module name. You then run buf mod update, which will create or update a lock file. Don't forget to check this one into your version control system. And 3, you've been doing this all along. You import your proto files like you normally would, and then you start referencing your definitions. We have documentation available at buf.build/docs. Search for dependency management. And lastly, there's a public Slack channel for like-minded folks that want to talk about Protobuf, APIs, RPCs, or anything in between. So until the next one, cheers.